Nestled deep within the whispering pines of the northern mountains, Keanu Reeves' cabin stood as a quiet testament to peace. The early morning sun spread gold across the wooden porch, melting the frost that clung to the rails, and a light mist danced lazily over the valley below. Inside, the faint crackle of an old fireplace kept time with the rhythm of nature outside. This was Keanu's refuge, his escape from the cameras, chaos, and constant noise of the city. Every log, every stone, every creak of the wood held meaning. He had built this cabin himself years ago, seeking silence and simplicity. Here, he found something Hollywood never offered him: stillness. That morning began like any other. Keanu stepped out with a mug of black coffee, wearing his flannel shirt and calm expression. The world around him seemed untouched. The scent of pine needles, the chorus of distant birds, and the crunch of gravel under his boots. But as he approached the edge of his property, something felt off. There, standing awkwardly against the earth, was a bright orange stake driven into the soil. He frowned slightly, crouched, and touched it. The paint was still wet. His gaze drifted across the yard and landed on more orange marks, lines drawn carelessly through his grass, leading toward the fence. It wasn't vandalism. It was deliberate. He followed the markings until he found a paper stapled to his gate, an official-looking notice stamped with bold letters: Mountain Ridge Homeowners Association, Property Inspection. Keanu read the notice twice, his face composed yet sharp with focus. He had never joined any association. His cabin sat on private, independently owned land, miles away from any subdivision or gated community. Yet here it was, a formal declaration that his property was being assessed for community compliance and potential sale readiness. He looked around at the trees, the open space, the mountain wind, the very definition of freedom, and something inside him grew still. There was no anger, no outburst, just the calm realization that someone had crossed a line. He folded the notice neatly, tucked it under his arm, and walked back toward his cabin, the weight of quiet defiance in each step. Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with small symbols of a thoughtful life. An old guitar leaned against the wall, books were stacked unevenly near the window, and a typewriter sat ready beside a half-written page. He placed the notice on his wooden table, poured another cup of coffee, and sat down. For a long moment, he simply stared at the paper. Then, almost as if fate was reminding him, his eyes drifted to the worn copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations that rested nearby. He opened it to a random page. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," it read. He smiled faintly. "Then it begins," he murmured under his breath. The words were steady, not a threat, but a promise to handle what came next with reason, not rage. By midday, the sun had climbed high, scattering light through the cabin windows. Keanu put on his jacket and grabbed a small camera. He spent the next few hours walking his land, photographing each stake, each orange mark, and every sign of intrusion. Near the eastern fence line, he found fresh footprints, heavy, official-looking boots. Whoever had walked there had done so recently. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was trespass. He followed the tracks until they vanished into the gravel road beyond his gate, then stopped. The mountain air was crisp, but his gaze was calm, sharp as ever. "You can't control the wind," he said softly, "but you can fix your sails." That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Keanu sat on his porch watching the horizon. The stakes still glowed faintly in the fading light, stubborn reminders of arrogance. He rose, walked toward one, and pulled it from the ground. The sound of wood cracking echoed in the stillness as he snapped it in half and carried the pieces back to his cabin. When he threw them into the fire, the paint hissed and burned away, leaving only clean flame and silence. Sitting by the warmth, Keanu opened his notebook and wrote a single line: document, research, respond, legally, respectfully, completely. Outside, the mountains fell into darkness, and the wind moved through the trees like an ancient whisper. He sipped his tea and smiled faintly to himself. Peace had been disturbed, but peace would answer, not with fury, but with justice. The following morning, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and frost. A thin veil of fog clung to the valley, curling through the trees like ghostly breath. Keanu sat at his table, a stack of printed documents before him: land deeds, survey maps, and the legal title he had kept neatly folded since the day he bought the cabin. His handwriting filled the margins of a yellow notepad beside them, calm notes, dates, and measured observations. He wasn't angry, he was preparing. Outside, the sound of gravel crunching under tires drifted up the dirt road. His eyes flicked toward the window. It was rare for anyone to drive this high into the mountain. He rose slowly, set down his pen, and stepped out onto the porch. A white SUV rolled to a stop near his gate, its tires spitting dust. 3 people stepped out, 2 men and a woman, dressed in business casual outfits, holding clipboards and folders. The woman, clearly in charge, adjusted her blazer and looked up at the cabin with an air of quiet entitlement. She smiled politely, but her tone carried the clipped sharpness of authority. "Mr. Reeves," she called out, voice echoing through the trees. "We're here from the Mountain Ridge Homeowners Association. We sent you notice yesterday regarding your upcoming inspection." Keanu walked to the gate, his footsteps unhurried. "I saw it," he said calmly, resting a hand on the weathered wood. "But there must be a mistake. My property isn't part of any homeowners association." The woman exchanged a look with her colleagues, the kind of look that blends arrogance and dismissal. "Actually, this entire area has recently been brought under the Mountain Ridge Community umbrella," she replied, her voice sweet but firm. "We're standardizing all properties for future development, integration, and resale. Your land falls within our extended boundary line." Keanu's expression didn't change, but his silence carried weight. He studied her face for a moment, then glanced at the 2 men behind her, who had already started walking around his gate, snapping photos of his yard without permission. "Please don't cross the line," he said quietly. They hesitated for half a second, long enough for the woman to smirk. "This is all procedural," she said. "We have authority to assess property conditions." One of the men stepped past the gate. Keanu moved forward, not fast, not loud, but with the kind of presence that made people stop. "I said," his voice deepened slightly, "don't cross that line." The man froze, uncertain. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, his original land title notarized and signed nearly a decade ago. He held it out to the woman through the gate. "This is private, independently owned land," he said. "It's not part of any HOA, past or present. The boundary markers on record are here, and they haven't changed." The woman took the paper with a faint scoff, glancing over it without really reading. "That's outdated," she said. "Our association now oversees all neighboring parcels for development oversight. You'll be receiving an adjustment letter soon." The mountain breeze stirred between them, carrying the faint hum of a distant hawk's cry. Keanu's gaze softened, but his words sharpened. "Then I suggest your oversight stops at the gate," he said. The politeness in his tone made the words hit harder. The woman blinked, momentarily disarmed by his composure. "Mr. Reeves," she began, trying to regain footing, "if you resist compliance, we'll have to escalate legally." Keanu gave a small nod. "Good," he replied. "Let's make it legal. That way, you'll see exactly how wrong your paperwork is." There was no threat in his voice, only quiet certainty, like a chess player already seeing the checkmate several moves ahead. The team retreated reluctantly, snapping a few more photos as they returned to the SUV. The woman paused at her door and called back, "You'll be hearing from us soon." Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm counting on it." The car pulled away, leaving a trail of dust swirling through the crisp mountain air. When the sound faded, only silence remained, that sacred unbroken peace he valued so deeply. He turned back toward his cabin, his steps slow, deliberate. Inside, he placed his land deed back in its envelope, then opened his laptop. The faint hum of the machine filled the room as he began typing a letter, clear, factual, legally precise. It wasn't just a response, it was a warning wrapped in logic and law. As the light began to fade, Keanu stepped outside once more. The mountain shadows stretched long and cool across the yard. He walked to the fence where the officials had stood and gently brushed away the orange paint from the wood. His fingers steady. "You picked the wrong man to trespass," he whispered, not in anger but with quiet conviction. The evening sky above him burned gold against the darkening pines, and somewhere in that silent vastness, the mountains seemed to nod in agreement. The storm never came with thunder. It came with quiet focus. For the next several days, Keanu remained inside his cabin, surrounded by papers, maps, and law books that looked far too ordinary for the brilliance being shaped within those walls. The world outside moved on. Birds sang, rain kissed the pine needles, and mist drifted through the valley, but inside, a silent kind of justice was taking form. The laptop's glow flickered across his calm face as he typed, reviewed, and cross-referenced every line of property law. To anyone else, it might have looked obsessive. To Keanu, it was meditation. He was not preparing for a fight. He was composing a masterpiece of logic, respect, and truth. The HOA's arrogance had awakened something in him, not fury, but precision. He started by requesting official land records from the county registry, tracing the deed's chain of title all the way back to the original 1968 land allotment. Every transfer, every parcel, every amendment was documented in his careful handwriting. By the third night, his desk looked like a courtroom in miniature, binders stacked neatly, tabs marked with color-coded notes. He had uncovered what they had likely never expected anyone to find. The HOA's so-called expansion had no legal authority over his property. Their claim was based on a misfiled annexation map that incorrectly included several private plots, his cabin among them. What they had done wasn't just overreach, it was trespass backed by corporate negligence. When the evidence came together, Keanu leaned back in his chair, sipping tea as the rain tapped against the window. His legal response wasn't just a letter, it was a document that could end careers. Calmly and precisely, he outlined the HOA's unlawful actions: unauthorized entry, misrepresentation of jurisdiction, and procedural violations of property rights under state law. But he didn't stop there. He cited every clause, attached photographic evidence, and referenced the exact court cases that protected independent landowners. He even included a subtle but powerful note: if another unauthorized entry occurred, he would pursue not only civil damages but also public exposure of their malpractice through media channels. It was factual, not emotional, a blend of intellect and elegance only someone like Keanu could craft. He printed 3 copies, one for his records, one for the county office, and one for the HOA. The next morning, as dawn washed the cabin in pale gold, he placed each document into an envelope, sealed them with deliberate care, and slid the final one into his leather satchel. Then he stepped outside, taking a moment to breathe in the mountain air. The world felt lighter, sharper, aligned once more. As he walked down the path toward the post office in the small town below, the forest whispered around him like a guardian. Every crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoed with quiet resolve. He wasn't sending a threat, he was sending truth, and truth, when written correctly, needs no volume to be heard. Later that evening, he returned to the cabin and watched the sun melt behind the peaks. The fire crackled gently as he sat by the window, reading over his own letter one final time. There was a beauty in the symmetry, how something born of arrogance had become a lesson in restraint and reason. He didn't wish harm on anyone. He simply wanted respect restored, not just for himself, but for every person who believed that peace should not be invaded under the banner of authority. As the light faded, he closed the folder, placed it in his drawer, and whispered softly, "Now, let's see if they can read as well as they can trespass." Days later, as the mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and freedom once again, a certified letter would arrive at the HOA's office, a letter that would make board members pale and lawyers hesitate. It wasn't rage that they would read in those pages. It was clarity, the kind that dismantles power with truth. The sun had barely crested the ridge when the first phone call shook the HOA office. The manager, a man too accustomed to being obeyed, picked up the line expecting another complaint from a resident. Instead, his tone faltered as the voice on the other end, the county registrar, politely informed him that their recent annexation claim had been declared invalid. By mid-morning, 3 more calls followed. One from a local journalist asking for comment, one from a neighboring landowner thanking Keanu for standing up, and one from their own attorney advising them to fix this quietly before it becomes a case study. Meanwhile, up in the mountains, Keanu sat by his cabin's porch, coffee steaming in the crisp air. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. The quiet rustle of pines was reward enough. He knew that when truth moves, it doesn't need an audience, it only needs time. A soft breeze carried the faint sound of an approaching vehicle. Down the gravel road came a glossy SUV with the HOA's logo. It stopped at the gate that they had once entered without permission. Now, the gate stood tall and locked, with a single wooden sign hanging on its center. Private property. Trespassers will be filmed and educated. Two board members stepped out, holding an envelope in their hands, dressed far too formally for the wilderness. One of them, a man with a rehearsed smile, called out, "Mr. Reeves, we just wanted to clear the air. There seems to have been some misunderstanding." Keanu rose slowly, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. He walked to the gate, his hands in his pockets, and simply said, "No misunderstanding. You trespassed. I educated." The man chuckled awkwardly, trying to regain footing. "Well, we'd like to formally apologize on behalf of the association and assure you that your property has been removed from the HOA map. It was all just a clerical error." Keanu studied them for a moment, not with hostility, but with the kind of patience that makes others nervous. Then he said softly, "A clerical error doesn't cut a man's fence. It doesn't post a for sale sign on land that isn't yours. You didn't make an error. You made a choice. And now you've learned something from it." His voice carried no anger, just the weight of truth. He took the envelope they offered, not as a gesture of peace, but as acknowledgement of responsibility. "You'll fix the damages," he added, "and I'll consider this settled. But let's be clear, this land is not governed by fear or arrogance. It's governed by respect." The two men nodded, humbled, words failing them. They turned and left, the SUV's tires kicking up dust as it retreated down the mountain. That night, news spread quietly through the community. The HOA had backed down, not because of confrontation, but because someone had simply stood their ground with grace and intelligence. Keanu's story became a quiet legend whispered in local cafes, on hiking trails, and across property lines. Some called it luck. Others called it poetic justice. But those who truly knew the man understood it was something deeper, a balance of kindness and resolve, forged by years of living life on his own terms. As dusk settled, Keanu lit a lantern and sat by the same gate they had once violated. The valley below shimmered with starlight, and the forest seemed to breathe easier. He ran his hand across the wooden post, freshly repaired, and smiled faintly. He hadn't just won a legal battle, he had restored the sanctity of silence, the kind that only exists when peace is respected. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. Keanu looked up, eyes reflecting the moonlight, and whispered, "That's how justice should sound, quiet, but heard by everyone." Weeks passed, and autumn painted the mountain with strokes of amber, crimson, and gold. The forest around Keanu's cabin seemed to hum with a kind of quiet approval, as if nature itself had taken note of his victory. The incident with the HOA had faded from the headlines, but its echo lingered far beyond paperwork or property lines. In town, people spoke of it not as gossip, but as legend. A man who hadn't shouted, threatened, or fought, yet had managed to bring an entire organization to its knees with truth and composure. They called it CinematicJustice, a name that somehow fit perfectly. Keanu continued his days as before, chopping wood, brewing coffee, feeding the stray dog that had made his porch its home. But something had changed. Every so often, strangers would pass by the trail near his land. Hikers, neighbors, even young lawyers, and they'd stop to look at the gate. Some took photos of the wooden sign he'd left there, still reading, "Private property. Trespassers will be filmed and educated." Others left small notes of thanks under the gate, written on napkins or folded paper. Messages like, "Thank you for standing up for peace," or, "You reminded us that silence can be strength." Keanu never replied, but he kept every note in a small wooden box inside his cabin. One evening, as twilight melted into indigo, he received an unexpected visitor, a young woman carrying a folder. She introduced herself as a law student from a nearby university. "Mr. Reeves," she began shyly, "we studied your case in our ethics seminar. Our professor called it an example of nonviolent resistance in modern property law." She smiled nervously, adding, "I just wanted to say, your letter taught me more about justice than any textbook could." Keanu chuckled softly, eyes kind. "Justice," he said, "isn't about punishment. It's about balance. You don't need to shout to be heard, you just need to be right." The student nodded, visibly moved, and thanked him before walking back down the trail. Later that night, the cabin glowed from within, its windows casting warm light into the cool mountain air. Keanu sat at his old desk, flipping through the now-faded legal letter that had changed everything. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying faint echoes of the conflict long resolved. He thought about the world beyond, The noise, the arrogance, the constant fight for control, and then he looked around his small wooden sanctuary, where peace ruled instead of power. He smiled faintly, whispering, "Maybe justice isn't something you take. Maybe it's something you remind people still exists." The camera would pull back slowly, rising above the cabin as night deepened, the stars scattered like diamonds across the endless dark. Down in the valley, the lights of the town twinkled softly, unaware that somewhere above them, a quiet man had rewritten the meaning of defiance. His victory wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was cinematic, the kind of justice that doesn't need applause to be eternal.